Hello, my name is Bob Rietveld, preaching and teaching minister of the Spring Hill Christian Church, and welcome to another lesson on From Now to Eternity, prophecies about the end times. And I believe we're on lesson number 9, quite possibly. Anyway, we finished talking about Israel's place in biblical prophecy and the end times. We talked a little bit about that. Last week we finished up that 3-part series of this lesson series, sub-lesson. And today we're going to start, the lesson is, are we heading for Armageddon? And again, I want to remind you that this information is gleaned from Dr. Jack Cottrell's book, The Collected Writings of Jack Cottrell, Volume 12, From Now to Eternity, Prophecy in the End Times, printed by the Christian Restoration Association. And I want to make sure that I give him full credit for that. I learned a little bit from some of the studies under him when I was in seminary on this topic, but most of it comes from that particular book. So I just want to share that with you today. So when Christians think about the end times or the state of the world that's leading up to Christ's return, there are two extremes. On the one hand, some have thought that the world situation will just keep getting better and better until an actual paradise-like environment will exist, mainly as the result of worldwide evangelism. And we've seen that some refer to this as a post-millennial worldview, and you can look at a little bit more of an explanation of those different millennial worldviews in my lesson series prior to this about prophecy in the end times as well. Christ will then return after or post the millennial paradise has dominated the world for its allotted 1,000 years, this belief system talks about. At the beginning of the 20th century, many Christians speculated that this time was approaching since the world seemed to be in a state of peace, and scientific discoveries were bringing about many improvements in lifestyle, and this was the heyday of the old liberalism's social gospel interpretation of Christianity. However, this bubble of optimism was burst in 1914. If you know what happened then, World War I. On the other hand, many believe that the world situation will keep getting worse and worse as the time of Christ's return approaches, and we will see that this is the view by biblical teaching. But there's a serious disagreement among Bible believers as to what this might mean. What will be the nature of the negativity that will envelop the earth? What kind of disasters, adversities, calamities will dominate the world? There seems to be two choices. Either the world will be subjected to extreme physical evils and conflicts, or it will be the target of unprecedented spiritual attacks. And it seems that most Bible believers, under the influence of what's called dispensational premillennialism, accept the view that the world's physical conditions will keep getting worse and worse just prior to the second coming of Jesus. And this is interpreted in terms of political and military conflicts. An example of this view is from, as I talked about earlier, Hal Lindsey's book, The Late Great Planet Earth, where he says, sometime in the future there will be a 7-year period climaxed by the visible return of Jesus Christ. There is more prophecy concerning this period than any other era the Bible describes. This period will be marked by the great devastation that man has ever brought upon himself. Mankind will be on the brink of self-annihilation when Christ suddenly returns to put an end to the war of wars called Armageddon. And that comes from his book, pages 32 through 34 of his 1970 publication. This version of the final days is typical of the widespread view that I call dispensational premillennialism. Regarding Bible prophecy, its motto is keep your eyes on the Middle East. And if you remember, we talked a little bit about that our last lesson. When anything unusual occurs over there, especially of a military nature, these people immediately conclude that the Battle of Armageddon is just about to happen in fulfillment of Bible prophecy. People such as Lindsay like to construct detailed scenarios of physical battles and persecution based on their assumptions of how prophecy should be interpreted as drawn piecemeal from all over the Bible. And as Lindsay says on page 33, the pieces are scattered in small bits throughout the Old and New Testament. Each interpreter has a few unique twists, but their overall pictures is about the same, and it focuses mostly on the final 7 years of the church era, just following the secret rapture and prior to Christ's visible return, according to that viewpoint. As they see it, Armageddon will be the climax of a series of physical battles that are focusing on national Israel. And this will allegedly involve incredible physical persecution for anyone left behind when the rapture occurs. And so, what I'm about to talk about is a summary of a typical version of these end time events that are based on Hal Lindsey's book, along with the prophecies that they are supposed to be fulfilling. They believe this. First of all, that the scattered Israelite nation will return to its homeland, Palestine. Ezekiel 36, 24 and 28, chapter 37, verses 21 and 22. This is seen as having already occurred in 1948. The next best thing will be the rebuilding of the temple on its original site. They quote Zechariah 6:12 and following, and Ezekiel chapters 41 through 46. They believe another great event will be the revival of the ancient Roman Empire. This is often equated with the European nations, Daniel 9:23. This coalition will be headed by the Antichrist, Revelation 13:1 and following. The Antichrist will make a pact with Israel, chapter 9 of Daniel, verse 27, followed by 3.5 years of peace and prosperity. And many conversions will take place through the ministry of the Jewish remnant. But then the Antichrist will break the covenant with Israel according to this belief system and set himself up as God in the Jews' temple. 2 Thessalonians 2:4 and Matthew 24:15, they so interpret. This begins the 3.5 years of tribulation and war, which will lead up to the Battle of Armageddon, according to this view, Matthew chapter 24, verses 15 through 21. The entities that are involved in these wars include the kings of the south, who invades and attacks Israel, Daniel 11:5 through 6 and verse 40. And the king of the north usually identifies as Russia, Gog leading Magog, which pushes it up on Israel from above. Ezekiel chapter 38, verses 14 through 16, the first part, and it continues on and overwhelms the Arab nations as well, Daniel 11:42 through 43. And at this point, God intervenes and destroys Gog and Magog, Ezekiel 38:18 through 22, and Ezekiel 39:6. Then they claim comes the climactic mother of all battles, World War III. The last great war of mankind, says Lindsay. 200 million Chinese march westward overland to Israel. They quote Revelation 16:12, 14, and 16, as well as Revelation 9:14, 16. The Antichrist marches eastward toward Israel with a European army. These two huge forces meet at Armageddon. They say, Revelation 16:16, where it says, and they gather them together to the place which in Hebrew is called Har Mageddon. This Hebrew term literally means Mount of Megiddo, but it usually designates the entire plain of Megiddo, mentioned elsewhere in the Bible as the scene of other battles. For example, this is where Barak and his army defeated Sisera's army with no more than 20,000 involved. Also in Judges 4 and 5, especially 5:19, which mentions the waters of Megiddo. Here also King Josiah was defeated and killed by the Egyptian king, Pharaoh Necho. 2 Kings 23:28 through 30. The town of Megiddo was about 20 miles southwest of the Sea of Galilee and about 55 or 57 miles north of Jerusalem. And in this relatively small place, the two armies of hundreds of millions are supposed to confront one another, and amid fierce and fighting and great destruction brought about by modern weaponry, many Jews are then converted. Zechariah 13:8 and 9, they claim. Then just as Israel is about to be completely overwhelmed and demolished, Christ returns, lands on the Mount of Olives, on Mount Olivet, on the eastern side of Jerusalem, just east of the temple. And here he begins to rescue the believing Jews from their tribulation and annihilates the enemy, according to them, Zechariah 14:1 through 4 and verse 12. And so then now the millennial kingdom can begin, according to this view. The scenario that I just described that comes from Dr. Cottrell's book is the kind of thing that many Christians think of when they hear the term the Battle of Armageddon. But our question is this: is this kind of warfare that will precede Christ's second coming? Is this what we can expect as the end draws near? Is this the picture of prophecy that is painted for us, or is there another and indeed better way to understand prophecy about the great war or battle that will precede Christ's return? Now, we have to remember, again, God's own rules for interpreting prophecy. He tells us in Numbers 12:6 through 8 and Hosea 12:10, as well as in Revelation 1:1, that he speaks through the prophets in riddles, parables, and signs or symbols. In other words, figurative language representing spiritual realities. And we've already seen how this is true of Israel and the millennial kingdom. What we are going to be looking at and talking about here is that this applies to also the physical imagery used of events prior to Christ's return. The graphic and gory descriptions of great military conflicts are God's symbolic way of picturing spiritual warfare. For example, see Ezekiel 38 verses 14 through 16, Daniel 11:40 through 12:1, and in the New Testament, Ephesians 6:12. In other words, the Armageddon armies are not necessarily engaged in political and military conflicts, but in spiritual battles. The enemies of Christ, the church, and truth will rise up and attack Christ and his church and his word. This will happen not just in one small geographical location in the Middle East, but everywhere. And it will happen to some degree, not just for a brief 3 and 1/2 years, but throughout the whole history of the church before it intensifies just prior to Christ's return. We can call this intensified period Armageddon if we want, but we need to remember these things. Its nature is spiritual. Its scope is worldwide, and its target is the church, not Israel. And it is present in some degree throughout Christian history. It does seem to be the case, though, that there will be a concentrated attack of a spiritual nature on the church near the end of history. And this is what we're dealing with in this lesson and in the next. Our question is, what can we expect to take place shortly before the second coming of Christ? Basically, we can expect spiritual warfare to intensify just before the end. So, what do? We go to the Bible. What does the Bible teach us about this? First, we have to ask, where in the Bible do we find the teaching that there will be an intensification of spiritual warfare leading up to the second coming? And so we're going to look at some texts that teach this particular truth. First thing, Antichrist, 1 John chapter 2, verses 18 through 22, and 1 John 4, 3, and 2 John 2, 7. Those are the texts that I'm going to begin with, even though the only New Testament passage that uses this term and not talking about the end times as we usually use that phrase. The main text is 1 John 2, 18 through 22. Children, it is the last hour, and just as you heard that Antichrist is coming, even now many Antichrists have appeared. From this we know that it is the last hour. They went out from us, but they were not really of us, for if they had been of us, they would have remained with us. But they went out, so that it would be shown that all are not of us. But you have an anointing from the Holy One, and you all know. I have not written to you because you do not know the truth, but because you do know it, and because no lie is of the truth. Who is the liar but the one who denies that Jesus is the Christ? This is the Antichrist, the one who denies the Father and the Son. 1 John chapter 4, verse 3 adds, and every spirit that does not confess Jesus is not from God. This is the spirit of the Antichrist, of which you have heard that it is coming, and now it is already in the world. And also in 2 John 7, for many deceivers have gone out into the world, those who do not acknowledge Jesus Christ as coming in the flesh. This is the deceiver and the Antichrist. The main thing that we learn from these passages is that the mission of the Antichrist is not political or military, but spiritual. The spirit of the Antichrist is the spirit of deception, false doctrine, false teaching, especially about Jesus Christ. The second thing we learn is that this deception is not limited to the end times, but was already present in the early decades of the church. The third thing is that such deception is indeed characteristic of the last hour, 1 John 2:18. And when John said that his own era is the last hour, most take that to mean that John was saying that his age was a last hour kind of time. In other words, that which you must expect to be rampant in the last days is already with us. The last thing to learn from this is that there will not be just one person who is the Antichrist. John says there will be many deceivers and many Antichrists. The next scripture is Revelation 20, verse 3 and verses 7 through 9, talking about the loosing of Satan. Now, we saw in a previous lesson that Satan was bound, that Christ bound the devil when he came the first time, Revelation 20, verse 1 through 3. And this is intended to last for 1,000 years, which is a figurative number for most of the church age. But when this long time is over, the devil must be released or loosed for a short time. Verse 3. Now, we're going to note that there is no reference to the specific length of this short time. It is short in contrast with the long time, symbolized as 1,000 years. The important thing is the description of what will happen in this short time as taught in Revelation 20, verses 7 through 9. When the 1,000 years are completed, Satan will be released or loosed from his prison and will come out to deceive the nations which are in the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them together for the war. The number of them is like the sand of the seashore, and they came up on the broad plain of the earth and surrounded the camp of the saints and the beloved city, and fire came down from heaven and devoured them. We learn from this that the resulting war is not located in one small valley in Israel, but it is worldwide in the four corners of the earth. We learn that the battle is spiritual in nature, involving mainly lies and deception to deceive the nations. We learn that the worldwide target is the camp of the saints and the beloved city, which are New Testament terms for the church. And we learn that this warfare will end when fire from heaven destroys the enemies, which is the second coming of Christ. The scripture, 2 Thessalonians 2, verses 3 through 12, talking about the man of lawlessness. In Paul's writing, the text that seems to cover the same ground as Revelation 20, verses 7 through 10. And it's about the last days, indicating that this final period will be characterized by deception and wickedness. It also mentions a figure that seems to be parallel to John's Antichrist, the man of lawlessness, verse 3. Here's the text. Let no one in any way deceive you, for it will not come unless the apostasy comes first, and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction, who opposes and exalts himself above every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, displaying himself as being God. Do you not remember that while I was still with you, I was telling you these things? And you know what restrains him now, so that in his time he will be revealed. For the mystery of lawlessness is already at work. Only he who now remains will do so until he is taken out of the way. Then that lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord will slay with the breath of his mouth and bring to an end by the appearance of his coming. That is, the one whose coming is in accord with the activity of Satan, with all power and signs and false wonders, and with all the deception of wickedness for those who perish, because they did not receive the love of the truth so as to be saved. For this reason, God will send upon them a deluding influence, so that they will believe what is false, in order that they all may be judged who did not believe the truth, but took pleasure in wickedness. The man of lawlessness seems to be a final and extreme form of Antichrist. He is also called the son of destruction, since his mission is to destroy the church, the camp of the saints in the beloved city. His weapons are deception, verse 10, and apostasy, verse 3. He's under restraint throughout the church age, which is the time of the binding of Satan at Christ's first coming. But in the end, the restraint is withdrawn, which is the loosening of Satan, verses 6 and 7. He himself is a man of lawlessness. In other words, sin and wickedness, and those under his power accept his deception to justify their own wickedness. Verse 10, the deception of wickedness, took pleasure in wickedness. Verse 12, Jesus destroys him at the appearance of his coming. Verse 8, the fire from heaven in Revelation chapter 20, verse 9. Then we look at 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 1, and 2 Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 through 5. And that text, emphasizes that the last times will be filled with excessive wickedness. And two other passages from Paul's letters drive this point home. In 1 Timothy 4:1, he says, "But the Spirit explicitly says that in later times some will fall away from the faith, paying attention to the deceitful spirits and doctrines of demons." This corresponds to the emphasis on deception, falling away from the faith, deceitful spirits, in the passage from 2 Thessalonians 2. And it also identifies Satan as the ultimate source of all these things. 2 Timothy 3 verses 1 through 5 says, "But realize this, that in the last days difficult times will come. For men will be lovers of self, lovers of money, boastful, arrogant, revilers, disobedient to parents, ungrateful, unholy, unloving, irreconcilable, malicious gossips, without self-control, brutal, haters of good, treacherous, reckless, conceited, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, holding to a form of godliness although they have denied its power. Avoid such men as these." These verses expand on the wickedness emphasized in 2 Thessalonians 2 text. And such wickedness will be especially widespread in the last days. Now, finally, Revelation chapter 16, verses 12 through 16, Armageddon. That's the only text that mentions a place called Armageddon. So let's read that. The sixth angel poured out his bowl on the great river, the Euphrates, and its water was dried up, so that the way would be prepared for the kings from the east. And I saw coming out of the mouth of the dragon, and out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet, 3 unclean spirits like frogs, for they are spirits of demons, performing signs, which go out to the kings of the whole world, to gather them together for the war of the great day of God the Almighty. Behold, I am coming like a thief. Blessed is the one who stays awake and keeps his clothes, so they will not walk about naked, and men will not see his shame. And they gather them together to the place which in Hebrew is called Har Megiddon. Here, the dragon is Satan, and the beast and false prophet represent anti-Christian political entities and philosophies that constantly attack Christians. The event of spewing out of their mouth corresponds to the loosing of Satan. And the miracle-working demons are the same as 2 Thessalonians 2:9. The kings are not just earthly monarchs, but the culture kings who determine what people believe and disbelieve. Philosophers, academia, the media, false religions. The war of the great day of God is the final event before the second coming of Christ. And the great day of God is the second coming, as indicated by verse 15. This war on that day, this battle of Armageddon, is never initiated. The enemies of God are pictured as gathering together for war, just as Satan's armies in Revelation 20, verse 9, are just surrounding the camp of the saints, the church. But the only actual blow that is struck in this final battle is by the Lord Jesus himself, as he sends fire from heaven to devour these enemies. Revelation 20, verse 9, which is the breath of his mouth, by which he slays them by the appearance of his coming. 2 Thessalonians 2:9. So, in summary, when we talk about the signs of the times, they are, when people talk about that, they're usually referring to things that we can identify in our present world that are signs or evidence that the second coming of Christ may be imminent or just around the corner. When we examine all of the biblical texts that we just talked about, we can discern 3 main things that we can look for as such signs. First, deception. Second, wickedness. And third, persecution of Christians. The emphasis is on deception and wickedness. But the fact that the church is specified as the object or targets of such attacks indicates that we will in some way personally feel the effect of this satanic assault. This seems to suggest a kind of tribulation, at least of a spiritual kind. So that leads us to ask the next question: are we in the end times now? Which is a great question, and I will attempt to answer that in our next lesson. So I hope you've enjoyed this lesson, this first part about are we heading for Armageddon? As much as I have enjoyed presenting it to you, remember this is from Dr. Jack Cottrell's book, The Collected Writings of Jack Cottrell, number 12, From Now to Eternity, Prophecy in the End Times. I want to give him full credit for that. I hope you have a great rest of the day, and may God bless you.